There is a bridge. And for more than 3 years, that bridge has been the single most important piece of infrastructure in Europe's most consequential war. Every military analyst watching this conflict agrees on at least one thing. When that bridge finally comes down, the war in the Black Sea fundamentally changes. Tonight, we examine exactly how close that moment may be, and why the events of just the past few weeks have shifted the balance in ways that even optimists did not anticipate. Why Crimea decides everything. To understand the full weight of what is happening right now in and around the Crimean Peninsula, you need to understand why Crimea is not simply a contested strip of land. It is the geographical and strategic heart of Russia's entire southern war. When Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared in 2022 that the war began with Crimea and will end with Crimea, he was not speaking in metaphor. He was describing a military reality. The peninsula juts deep into the Black Sea, forming a natural fortress from which Russia can project naval and aerial power across the entire region. Its ports, above all Sevastopol, gave Russia's Black Sea fleet a platform from which to threaten every Ukrainian coastal city, to blockade grain shipments, and to rain cruise missiles down on civilian infrastructure hundreds of kilometers away. For Putin personally, Crimea has always been more than territory. Its annexation in 2014 was the founding myth of his nationalist project, the moment that he told the Russian people the empire was returning. The peninsula's military infrastructure, its ability to anchor operations across the southern front, its psychological value to the Kremlin, all of this makes Crimea the irreplaceable cornerstone of Russia's war. But the picture has changed. Drastically, verifiably, and in ways that are now documented in satellite imagery, maritime tracking data, and official military assessments from multiple Western governments. Russia can no longer safely use any of the major ports on the peninsula. Its legendary naval stronghold at Sevastopol, a base that dates to the 18th century, that withstood sieges in 2 world wars, that was the pride of the Soviet and then Russian Navy, is today functionally abandoned. The Black Sea Fleet has been forced to flee to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland, hundreds of kilometers to the east, and even there, it is not safe. The airports on Crimea are under systematic pressure. Air defense systems have been struck repeatedly, fuel depots have burned, and the bridge, the great Kerch Bridge, Putin's $12 billion symbol of Russia's grip on the peninsula, continues to take hits. If Ukraine can complete the isolation of the peninsula, the bridge will eventually fall. And when it does, Crimea becomes not a fortress, but a trap. The funding breakthrough. Of course, none of this happens without money, weapons, and political will. And for months, one man had been standing in the way of the most critical financial lifeline available to Ukraine. Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister for 16 years, had consistently blocked, delayed, or undermined European Union support for Ukraine. His veto posture on the continent's defense packages made him, in practical terms, Russia's most valuable ally inside the European Union. That changed in a single night. On April 12, 2026, Hungarian voters went to the polls in what analysts had described as the most consequential election in the EU that year. A referendum, in effect, on whether Hungary would continue its drift toward authoritarianism and alignment with Moscow, or change course toward European democracy. The result was historic. Peter Magyar's center-right Tisza party won a landslide supermajority, securing around 138 seats out of 199 in parliament, on more than 53% of the national vote. Orban's Fidesz party, which had dominated Hungarian politics for over a decade and a half, collapsed to 55 seats. Orban himself conceded on election night. After 16 years, the Orban era was over. The consequences for Ukraine were immediate and concrete. The incoming Magyar government signaled it would not block the €90 billion EU support package for Ukraine, a deal that had already been agreed politically by 24 EU member states and passed by the European Parliament, but which had faced continued turbulence from Budapest's posture under Orban. That package is structured to deliver €60 billion for military procurement, weapons, ammunition, and defense equipment, and €30 billion in direct budgetary support to keep Ukraine's government and public services functioning during wartime. The first tranche is expected to reach Ukraine in the second quarter of 2026. For a country that has absorbed the cost of a full-scale invasion for more than 4 years, while watching American support shift focus toward other theaters, this package represents a genuine lifeline. The funding question has, to a meaningful degree, been resolved. The question now is where that money goes, and what it is doing to Crimea. The naval collapse. Because the peninsula's military value is already being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, target by target. The most visible symbol of Crimea's strategic power was always the Black Sea Fleet. In February 2022, that fleet controlled the entire Black Sea from Sevastopol, launching missile barrages against Ukrainian cities and threatening every port and shipping lane along the country's southern coast. 3 years later, the picture is almost a mirror image of reversal. Ukraine, a country with no meaningful conventional navy, has managed to sink or seriously damage around 1/3 of Russia's warships. It achieved this through a combination of technologies that rewrote the rules of naval warfare in real time. Neptune anti-ship missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and above all, a new class of small, fast, inexpensive naval drones, unmanned surface vessels packed with explosives, that could penetrate Sevastopol's harbor defenses and reach ships that Russian commanders had considered safely out of range. The Black Sea Fleet has been forced to relocate all of its major assets from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland, a shift of more than 300 kilometers. The historic headquarters building in Sevastopol, struck by a Ukrainian cruise missile in 2023 and subsequently demolished, has been removed from Russia's list of cultural heritage sites. As one retired Ukrainian naval officer put it, there was practically nothing left in Sevastopol to command. But the fleet keeps getting hit, even at Novorossiysk. In December 2025, a Ukrainian underwater drone disabled a Russian submarine there, the first known use of that system in such an attack. In the spring of 2026, drone strikes on Russian frigates in the area continued, demonstrating that the relocation provided no permanent sanctuary. Meanwhile, the military infrastructure on the peninsula itself is collapsing under a sustained and methodical campaign of precision strikes. Oil terminals, fuel storage facilities, radar installations, and air defense batteries have been struck repeatedly. Railway ferries providing alternative supply routes have been hit. Air bases, Saki, Belbek, and others have taken repeated damage. The supply chain through which Russia maintains its garrison on the peninsula is fraying under the weight of continuous, intelligent, targeted pressure. And Ukraine's own air defenses are holding. Through a combination of Patriot and NASAMS missile systems and a rapidly expanding fleet of domestically produced interceptor drones, Ukraine has been achieving interception rates against Russian Shahed drone attacks that climbed to nearly 90% in early 2026, a figure that, even accounting for the relentless scale of Russian launches, represents a remarkable defensive achievement. Every percentage point of interception rate freed up Ukrainian energy and Western-supplied missiles, means more capacity to take the fight to Crimea. The Hodges strategy. There is a logic behind the seemingly scattered pattern of Ukrainian strikes on Crimean infrastructure. That logic is most clearly articulated by retired United States Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, a man who has been publicly arguing since the beginning of the conflict that liberating Crimea is both strategically essential and militarily achievable. Hodges's core proposition is this: you do not retake Crimea by launching a frontal infantry assault across the Perekop Isthmus. You retake it by making it impossible for Russia to sustain a credible military presence there. You starve the garrison. You blind the radar. You burn the fuel. You sever every supply line, by land, by sea, and by air. And then, when the peninsula has been militarily hollowed out from within, the physical recapture becomes not a mass casualty assault on prepared defenses, but the relatively straightforward task of retaking a besieged position from an exhausted and isolated enemy. The isolation campaign, in Hodges's framework, operates across three distinct dimensions. From the sea, Ukraine has already accomplished the core objective, expelling the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, destroying railway ferry routes, and disrupting port infrastructure. That dimension of the campaign is well advanced. From the bridge, Ukraine has maintained persistent pressure on the Kerch Strait crossing, the only direct land and rail link between mainland Russia and the peninsula. It was struck in October 2022, again in July 2023, and again in June 2025, when Ukrainian intelligence operatives mined the bridge's underwater supports over several months and detonated roughly 1,100 kilograms of explosive equivalents. The bridge remained open after each attack, but each strike imposed repair costs, closed traffic for hours, degraded Russian confidence in the route's reliability, and accumulated structural stress that engineers on both sides are watching closely. It is a campaign of attrition, not a single decisive blow. From the land, Ukraine is keeping Russian supply lines through the Zaporizhia corridor and the Donbass routes under consistent fire from HIMARS and other long-range systems. Every convoy that is forced to divert, every fuel truck that is delayed, every ammunition shipment that arrives late or incomplete is another increment of pressure on a garrison that has no local reserves to draw on. When these three dimensions work together, the strategic logic becomes overwhelming. The peninsula stops being a Russian military stronghold connected to the mainland. It becomes a besieged position, slowly consuming its own reserves with no reliable way to replenish them. And at that point, the second wave of the campaign becomes decisive. The second phase, as Hodges describes it, is about making Crimea militarily untenable. Not capturing ground, but making it impossible for Russian troops to function effectively where they stand. Airports are being shut down systematically. Fuel stocks are burning. Radar systems and air defense batteries are going dark. Command centers are being struck by long-range precision munitions. Ammunition storage facilities are exploding. The Russian garrison, without taking a single direct ground engagement, is being degraded from within. Morale deteriorates. The logistics chain fractures. The chain of command struggles to coordinate across a peninsula that is increasingly cut off from external support. Russian troops stationed on Crimea are living under the constant psychological pressure of knowing they can be struck at any time, from any direction, with no reliable sanctuary. The third and final phase, Hodges is emphatic, will not look like the Normandy landings. It will not require massed armored formations pushing across contested ground against prepared defensive positions. By the time a ground operation is ordered, the Russian defense on the peninsula will not be a resilient and well-supplied army. It will be a weary, isolated, under-resourced garrison that has been under siege for months. Taking a besieged fortress demands far fewer forces and causes far fewer casualties than storming one at full strength. This is not merely theoretical. It is a reversal of the traditional doctrine that says you win by breaching the enemy's defenses. Hodges argues instead that you destroy the logistics that sustain those defenses, and the defenses collapse on their own. The Russian military, an institution built on Soviet-era logistics dependency, is precisely the kind of force that this approach is designed to defeat. Cut the supply chain, and the tanks, the artillery, and the defensive line become expensive scrap metal. The weapons equation. The strategy is coherent, but its implementation depends on specific weapons, and the list of those weapons explains exactly why sustained Western support is not optional for Ukraine. It is existential. At the top of the requirements list are long-range precision munitions. ATACMS missiles, with operational ranges covering all significant military targets on the peninsula, have been used against Crimea and have proven their value in striking hardened infrastructure. Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles remain critical, particularly for hitting the Kerch Bridge and for striking command facilities in and around Sevastopol. Systems capable of penetrating hardened underground bunkers are essential, as Russia has been deepening its protected infrastructure. Taurus cruise missiles, which Germany has thus far not delivered to Ukraine despite significant domestic political pressure to do so, would meaningfully expand Ukraine's precision strike capability in the final phases of this campaign. HIMARS systems and their munitions are vital for maintaining pressure along the land corridors feeding the peninsula. The drone picture is more favorable. Ukraine's domestic long-range drone production has been growing at a pace that has surprised analysts. Kamikaze-type drones are conducting thousands of sorties monthly against oil depots, radar sites, and airfields on the peninsula. The naval drone program, the same unmanned surface vehicles that drove the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, continues to evolve. The Sea Baby variant played a central role in the 2023 and 2025 strikes on the Kerch Bridge, and newer models are demonstrating the ability to operate further from Ukrainian-controlled coastline. Fighter aircraft remain a constraint. The F-16 deliveries to Ukraine, while operationally significant, have not yet reached a scale that allows Ukraine to establish meaningful air superiority over the peninsula. The available pool of trained Ukrainian F-16 pilots is still limited. However, when combined with anti-radiation missiles capable of suppressing Russian radar and air defense networks, even a modest number of fourth-generation fighters can begin the process of opening the airspace over Crimea. Recent successful strikes on Russian radar installations are early indicators of this potential. Patriot and NASAMS systems continue to anchor Ukraine's own defensive layer. Having enough of these systems to protect Ukrainian cities from Russian counterstrikes creates the operational freedom to divert offensive attention to the peninsula. Ukraine's security is not separable from Ukraine's offensive capacity. The consistent message from Hodges and from other serious analysts is that additional long-range precision weapons and the political will to deliver them without restriction could complete the isolation phase of the Crimea campaign by the end of the summer of 2026. If those weapons arrive on schedule, the strategic timeline tightens dramatically. If they do not, the campaign slows, but does not stop. And time, in this particular equation, is working against Russia rather than Ukraine. Every month that passes, Crimea's infrastructure degrades a little further. Every month, the garrison's supply chain gets a little more unreliable. Every month, the military case for continuing to hold the peninsula at full cost becomes a little harder for the Kremlin to sustain. The momentum of war. The current operational picture across the broader war offers additional context that makes the Crimea strategy more credible, not less. On the front lines in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, Ukrainian forces have regained the initiative that was partially lost in the difficult months of late 2025. Counterattacks in the eastern sectors of those regions have pushed back against positions that Russia had consolidated. The front is not static. At the operational level, Russia appears unable to stop Ukraine's long-range strike campaign against its own energy, fuel, and defense infrastructure. Refineries, oil depots, and military production facilities deep inside Russian territory have been struck with increasing accuracy and frequency. Ukraine's willingness and ability to operate at range, demonstrated most dramatically in the audacious drone strikes on Russian strategic bomber bases in the summer of 2025, signals a strategic posture that has shifted from purely defensive to increasingly offensive at the systemic level. Meanwhile, the Russian president has become notably less visible. His public schedule has contracted. The concentration of air defense systems around Moscow and his private residences, including installations around his Valdai retreat, stands in stark contrast to the thinning of equivalent systems on the front lines and on Crimea itself. The message that sends, whether intentional or not, is one of a leadership that is prioritizing personal security over battlefield effectiveness. Ukrainian intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov has indicated that he observes Russian leadership looking for a way out, not an immediate capitulation, but an increasing awareness within Moscow that the trajectory of the war is not sustainable, and that the costs of continuing are beginning to accumulate in ways that threaten the internal stability of the regime. This is not a guarantee. War is not an equation, and assessments made from the outside carry real uncertainty. The Trump administration's reduced direct engagement on Ukraine has placed a heavier burden on European countries, and the majority of Ukraine's demonstrable gains over the past 18 months have come from its own ingenuity and its own sacrifice. Ukraine needs weapons, money, and sustained external commitment to complete the campaign it has begun. But consider what has already been confirmed. A third of the Black Sea Fleet has been sunk or damaged. Sevastopol is functionally unusable as a naval base. The Kerch Bridge has been struck 3 times and remains under constant pressure. Railway ferries have been hit. Airfields on the peninsula are degraded. Air defense radars are being blinded one by one. And 90 billion euros in European Union financing is being released in the weeks ahead. Under those conditions, the strategy that analysts and retired generals have been outlining for years is not a theoretical exercise. It is an active campaign, measurable, documented, and incrementally advancing. What changes if Crimea is reclaimed? And so, we must ask the question that the strategy ultimately points toward. If Ukraine does reclaim Crimea, when, and in whatever combination of military pressure and political negotiation that takes, what actually changes? The answer is almost everything. The most immediate and tangible gain is economic. Ukraine's entire southern coastline becomes secure. The ports of Sevastopol, Yevpatoria, and Feodosia, which were major transit hubs for Ukrainian grain and metal exports before the 2014 annexation, re-enter the Ukrainian economy. Marine insurance costs in the Black Sea fall dramatically. Commercial shipping routes normalize. Independent estimates suggest the restoration of full Black Sea access could add billions of dollars annually to Ukraine's export revenues, revenue that will be essential for rebuilding a country that has endured 4 years of total war. The energy dimension may be even more transformative. The Black Sea continental shelf in the waters around Crimea holds confirmed but undeveloped natural gas reserves. International energy companies were actively conducting exploration work in this area before Russia's 2014 annexation froze all activity. A return of Ukrainian sovereignty over those waters would open the most significant new energy development opportunity in European history since the opening of North Sea fields, an opportunity with profound implications not only for Ukraine's own energy independence, but for Europe's long-term effort to reduce its reliance on Russian gas supplies. From a military and security perspective, the recapture of Crimea would end Russia's capacity to project naval power across the Black Sea. A Black Sea fleet without Sevastopol, confined to Novorossiysk, becomes a regional coastal defense force, not a power projection instrument. Its capacity to threaten Romania, Bulgaria, or Turkey evaporates. NATO's southern flank is relieved of a chronic and costly pressure point. The Black Sea, effectively, becomes a zone of secure commerce. But the deepest and most durable consequence may be geopolitical. The recapture of Crimea would be the clearest demonstration since the end of the Second World War that territory seized by force can be reclaimed by law, by determination, and by the sustained commitment of a community of nations. That message is addressed not only to Moscow, it is addressed to every government on the planet that has observed whether aggression carries consequences. It is addressed to Beijing, which watches Taiwan with patient intent. It is addressed to every revisionist power testing the boundaries of the international order. The message is simple. There is a price to be paid for violating territorial integrity. That price will be collected. And inside Russia, the loss of Crimea would be devastating to the domestic narrative on which the entire justification for the war has rested. The slogan, "Crimea is ours," has been one of the central pillars of Putin's political legitimacy for 12 years. Its reversal would not merely be a battlefield defeat. It would shatter a myth, undermine the propaganda apparatus, and create the conditions for a level of internal pressure on the regime that has not existed at any point since the invasion began. Once the peninsula becomes militarily unsustainable, Putin faces a choice between two deeply unpalatable options: the negotiating table or a deeper internal collapse. Either outcome changes the direction of the war. The situation as it stands today is this. A third of Russia's Black Sea fleet has been destroyed or driven from its historic base. The Kerch Bridge has been struck 3 times and keeps drawing fire. The airports on the peninsula are degraded. The fuel depots are burning. The air defense radars are going dark. And 90 billion euros in European financing is now flowing toward Ukraine, because the man who spent years blocking it just lost an election by the largest margin in Hungarian democratic history. Crimea is Ukraine. That is not sentiment. It is the judgment of international law, of the United Nations, and of the overwhelming consensus of the international community. What is now increasingly clear is that it may also become the judgment of the battlefield. The question is no longer whether the strategy is viable. The question is whether the weapons, the political will, and the sustained support arrive fast enough to complete it. Because the bridge, as the general said, is eventually going to come down.